Good morning and welcome to this webinar organized by the Chair of Sociology of the Royal Military Academy. For many years we have conducted various research projects related to personnel recruitment, and it's of course a cornerstone of any organization. Ultimately, an organization is of course about its people. And while defense budgets have increased in recent years, it remains crucial to have individuals committed to serving in the Belgian armed forces. For the last years, we have, of course, also faced significant wave of retirement among our personnel. And in response, we have undertaken substantial recruitment efforts. Over the last legislative term, nearly 10,000 people were recruited, around 2,500 per year. The purpose of today's presentation is to focus on those who joined the Belgian Defence, began their training, started their career for some, but subsequently left, whether early in the training, and that will be the majority of them, at the start of their career, or slightly later in their professional journey. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope you find the session insightful. Let's get started. Okay, so I will begin this presentation, but my assistant and colleague, Lise Blokerije, will present the majority of the presentation. So I will give her the floor in 5 minutes. So I will be giving this presentation and start with a brief overview of the points we will cover in the around 25 minutes allocated to us. So I will present the main research question. Lise will present our data and analysis, of course, and the methodological part. And of course, the main part will be the results, then followed by conclusion and discussion. Okay, so you have probably already seen these numbers highlighted in press articles, often with focus on shocking numbers. The aim here is to break down these figures and show, for instance, that it's also important to contextualize the data. To truly understand a phenomenon, of course, it is useful to combine and to analyze multiple indicators, which exactly will be what we will try to do today with you. So, why are we working and researching on this topic? Here, it's really important to try to know why people leave an organization. And in the framework on our study, it has an impact on the operational readiness in order to maintain a force size which is adapted for current operations. It's also important in order to reduce recruitment and training costs by addressing, of course, avoidable attrition. And you will see that some kind of attrition can maybe be avoidable. And then it's also important to know why people are leaving while they were really keen to join us, and in that way to enhance the job satisfaction and the well-being of our personnel. So the idea here is to focus on those key objectives in order to analyze the main motivations. Okay. So our study is part of a broader human factors research initiative in collaboration with NATO partners. And the primary objective here, of course, is to examine the key determinants of voluntary attrition. And it's important to understand that we have several kinds of attrition, we have attrition among candidates. We have also career attrition. We have also foreseen attritions. This refers to the departures that are predictable or can be planned more or less in advance. For example, retirements, contract expirations, and so on. And we have unforeseen attrition, and it's our main focus. It involves unexpected departures, for example, resignations, and this, of course, can create organizational disruptions and a need, of course, sometimes specific measures to address, for example, staffing shortage. So as you can see and read on the slide, we have already produced together with Lise a national report that can be distributed in the coming months. And today's presentation is based on the analysis of data from the XXL of the DGHR. And I would like, of course, to take the opportunity to thank the Cell Exit for providing access to the data and for their very good cooperation. Okay. So here, as you can see, the overall attrition rate has more than doubled from 2008 to 2022. So the highest rate, if you can see it on the graph, are among privates and the lowest among officers. So we see clear differences according to rank. And the sharp increase, so from 6 to 13, is primarily driven by the large wave of military retirements in recent years. If we also look at the differences among categories of attrition, you see that candidate attrition rates, particularly so the unforeseen attrition, are significantly higher than the overall attrition rate that I just talked about. So in 2022, the overall attrition rate, as I mentioned, was 13, while the candidate attrition rate reached 23%. Again, with major differences according to categories, with the highest rates among privates and the lowest among officers. In contrast, career attrition rates are much lower and have remained, as you can see on the graph, stable over the years. And for 22, the career attrition rate, so later in a professional career, stood at just 6%. As you can see here from the 5 main research questions, our study examines why candidates, because I just explained why we have a special focus on them, leave the Belgian Defence prematurely, and how these motivations vary across different categories. And it also explores how these motivations have changed over the past decade, and whether they differ between social groups, for example, women, civilians, reservists. And finally, the research aims to draw lessons from this insight, this analysis, to improve retention strategies. And I will now hand over to Lise, who will provide a more detailed analysis of the data.
Thank you. So as we mentioned before, the research was done in collaboration with the Cell Exit. They conduct exit interviews and surveys with candidates who decide to leave Belgian Defence. So they analyze training attrition, and the results of these analyses are put in yearly reports. We received pre-codified data from them for the period between 2013 and 2023. And the goal of our analysis was to do a more thorough analysis of the exit data than has already been done in these yearly reports. We also received full exit interviews for the students at the RMA and the SDiff. And here we decided to use our own codification system with the same goal of doing a more thorough analysis of attrition at the RMA. Our data spans over a 10-year period between January 2013 and June 2023, with some small gaps. Unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, no exit interviews were done between February 2020 and December 2021. And it was decided as well that from 2022 on, no interviews were done with those candidates who left within the first 30 days of their training. This resulted in 4,167 respondents. For 2019, we also decided to include January 2022, and for 2023, we only have until June, so we only have about half a year of candidates. For the method, quantitative content analysis was used. This is the human coding of text into researcher-defined categories. This codification was done by the cell exit due to logistic and privacy reasons. The interviews were coded according to a predefined codification system that exists out of the following 16 main motivation and 65 sub-motivations. This was also coded according to importance, ranging from 5 most important to 1 least important. These 16 main motivations were used as our dependent variables, while we also have a wide array of independent variables, and these are social and demographic variables, and part of this we took from the exit survey as well. As you can see here, these are the main exit motivations in total and per category. And as you can see, for every category, the red motivation is at the top, and this is the job/military life being too challenging. And this means the feeling of not being able to conform to the demands of the military training and life. And it exists out of the following sub-motivations you can see in the green box. What we found here is that for privates, this exit motivation is mostly mentioned in the beginning of their training. For non-commissioned officers and privates, we found that French-speaking candidates are more likely to mention this exit motivation. And for officers and privates, we found that a lower sense of Belgian pride also meant that they were more likely to mention the military life being too challenging. Here we added 2 quotes to illustrate this exit motivation. As you can see, these people had issues with the constant time pressure, the lack of freedom, not being able to decide what they do with their own body, having to ask permission for a lot of things. We also found that women struggled a lot with the physical aspect of the training. They often felt like they weren't physically built for the heavy equipment and that they had a hard time catching up with the guys. And they felt like this difference in physique was often not taken into account or taken seriously by their instructors. Then we also have a small overview of the main sub-motivation per category. We discovered that officers mostly struggled with the academic part of the training. They found the courses difficult. They had a lot of effort to keep up with the daily tasks and study material. For non-commissioned officers, we found that they struggled a lot with the mental health and psychological aspect of the training. They found the leadership that was trusted upon them and the responsibility that came with it too difficult and too stressful. And this was mostly due to feeling insecure and feeling too young to take responsibility over often older people. And then for privates, we found that they found the typical military aspects of the training too hard, and they were not very interested in a job as infantry, and these problems mostly arose during the bivouacs. Then a second important exit motivation is monitoring issues. This is the encountering of problems with monitoring of one's career by higher management or the institution. This is most likely as well a reason to leave further in the training. However, for officer women, we found an opposite effect where they are more likely to mention it in the beginning of their training. For NCOs and privates, we found in general that women mention monitoring issues more, and that it also is mentioned less over time. However, here for NCO women, we found as well an opposite effect where they mention it more over time. And then for officers, we found that those that left in the VDKMS program were also less likely to mention it. And the majority of the issues that arose here are due to a lack of opportunities to advance further into their training or career. The third important exit motivation is the human environment. These are problems encountered in interaction with other actors within defense. This as well is more likely to be a reason when one is further into their training. Here we found that officers in the SDIF program were less likely to mention it. This is quite logical, as those in the SDIF are studying at a civilian university and spend the majority of their training in a civilian environment and not in a military environment. An important submotivation here is harassment from management and our colleagues. Luckily, overall, there's only a small percentage of people who mention harassment as an exit motivation, but obviously this holds a much bigger moral importance. And here we found that women especially are more likely to mention harassment from management and our colleagues as an exit motivation, and this is so across all categories. We also added some quotes here to illustrate here, and we see quite serious issues such as mockery and sexual harassment, being threatened or insulted, receiving misogynistic comments from their instructors. Here it's important to note that these are very rare instances and this doesn't happen a lot, but again, every instance of harassment is one instance too many, and it's still important to put a focus on this. Then we have having found an alternative option, and this is mostly having found another job opportunity. For officers, we see that they mention this more over time. However, they put less importance on it, so it's lower on their list of exit motivations. While for NCOs and privates, we found that Dutch speakers were more likely to mention it, and again, it's mentioned later in their training. Then we also have an exit motivation that is somewhat the opposite of our main exit motivation, and in this case it's the job not being challenging enough. So it's a feeling of a lack of challenge within the military training or life. This is mostly only of importance for NCOs and privates who mention it again later in their training, and also if they have a lower sense of Belgian pride or loyalty, they're also more likely to mention it. Here it's mostly due to a feeling of uselessness. So they mention that they get a lot of useless tasks, that there are a lot of dead moments, that they feel like they don't have enough work, that they are bored. And what's interesting here is that the job not being challenging enough is often mentioned together with the monitoring issues and or having found another job or study or training. And then in similar line, we got lack of information and or communication, and this is mostly due to issues with information given before the start of their training about the training. And here we see that officers that left in the VDKMS part of their training are less likely to mention it, and also that they are more likely to mention it in the beginning of their training. While for NCOs and privates, we notice a slightly decreasing time trend. Here as well, this issue with information and communication is often mentioned together with monitoring issues and with job not being challenging enough. Then for NCOs and privates, another very important exit motivation is medical issues, and this is especially of importance for privates, for whom it is the second most important exit motivation after job not being challenging. Job being too challenging, yes. Medical issues are mostly due to injuries at the lower limbs, and they're also more likely to mention it later in the training. And what we see is that these medical issues can often result in mandatory leave, that they are often mentioned together. And we do indeed see that about 37% of mandatory leave for NCOs and privates is due to medical reasons. Mandatory leave in general is a very important exit motivation for officers. This is the only non-voluntary exit motivation. However, there are some people who do decide to fail on purpose, but this is a minority. Here we see that men are more likely to mention it. It's also more likely to be mentioned later in the training. And we also notice that those in the air component are more likely to mention it. These are mostly pilots. Getting into the piloting program is very hard, and there are a lot of requirements. So those that do get in are often very highly motivated and will only leave when they have to. Here we see that the majority of this is due to professional failure, which is related to academic failure. This is quite logical. The officer training is a university level education, the major focus on academic prestation. And we also see that mandatory leave is often mentioned together with the academic part of finding the job too hard. So we also did a smaller study of attrition at the RMA, where we used the exit interviews from students at the RMA and SDiff. And here we used our own codification system with a bigger focus on the context of the RMA. And similarly, we found that study-related issues and military culture are the most important here. And here we found interesting, let's study the related issues, or more likely an issue for those in the SDiff, so studying at a civilian university, while the military culture aspect is more of an issue for those studying at the RMA. We see that mandatory leave seemed to be decreasing over time. And then we also see that there are many gendered issues affecting women, such as, again, discrimination and harassment, physical and psychological issues, and problems within the RMA. And these three exit motivations are often mentioned together. For discrimination and harassment, we notice that while men mention it less over time, for women this stays relatively stable. Here, of course, as well, discrimination and harassment is not mentioned a lot, but it just holds a bigger moral importance. So some conclusion, we see that most exit motivations stay relatively stable over time, with some small time trends here and there, but these are mostly related specifically to the categories. We do have some more general trends based on how far they are in their training. So we see that mandatory leave, human environment, and issues with monitoring are mentioned most likely later in the training. These have also some logical explanations. The process of mandatory leave is a very long time process. The further one is in the training, the more human actors they encounter, and the more likely it is that there might be some issues with some of them. And for issues with monitoring, we also noticed that most of these issues were due to the monitoring and future prospects of their career, which is something that will arise more towards the end of their training. And then for issues with adjustment, this is something that is more likely mentioned at the beginning of the training. Going from civilian life to military life is often takes a lot of adjustment, and any really big issues that can lead to exit will arise most likely within the first month of their training. Then in general conclusion, military life being too difficult is the main exit motivation across all categories. For officers, it's mostly related to academic life and difficulties because of the university level education. And we see some differences between the different kind of officer training as well. For NCOs, there's a wider array of exit motivations. There isn't really one clear theme, but they do seem to struggle with certain stress due to inexperience. While for privates, we see that medical issues and injuries play a very important role. This is mostly due to the very physical aspects of the job. We also notice that for NCOs and privates, they have very similar exit motivations and also very similar effects of social groups and demographics on these exit motivations compared to officers. Unfortunately, there are still some gendered issues affecting women disproportionately, such as harassment and discrimination, as well as physical inequalities and the ways this is treated by their instructors. And there are also still some other forms of harassment and discrimination. And lastly, there are still quite a lot of issues with monitoring and information both before and during their training. So what could we learn from this? First of all, the majority of reasons here are related to the core of Belgian defense. So what makes the military be the military? So the question we need to ask ourselves here is how to attract and keep more people without changing the core values and meaning of military life. This can possibly be done by providing more, better and transparent information before, during and after the training, as well as trying to make young people interested again in the values of military life by, for example, integrating the military more into the daily life and society. Secondly, we notice that academic difficulties are the main reasons for people leaving the RMA. Here we ask the question, how can we attract and keep more students at the RMA without losing the high quality of the training and the university education, which is very important. We can do that so by better preparing students before entering the RMA, providing sufficient help and guidance during their studies, as well as investigating the further possible differences between the RMA, SDIF and other forms of officer training and see what we can learn from that. Lastly, there are still too many issues with harassment, mainly experienced by women. So how do we get rid of all forms of harassment and discrimination by both instructors and other candidates? Then we have some small problems and shortcomings. First of all, we used qualitative data for quantitative analysis, which is not always fit. The exit surveys data was more fit for statistical analysis, but here we could not analyze all possible exit motivations. Our data was pre-codified, so we could not change anything about the codifications. This was also not possible practically because of the 1,500 exit interviews. Then we had some missing data during the COVID period, as well as now with for those leaving within the first 30 days, which can possibly influence the time effect of training. And then lastly, most importantly, we unfortunately only have data on those who leave and not those who stay. So it's not possible to do a real predictive analysis. The same exit motivations that are mentioned here could also very much be staying motivations. For example, the fact that the core values of military life are the main exit motivation can also very much be the main reason why people decide to stay. And a question we could ask here is, if the core values and aspects of military life are both the main reasons for attrition and retention, how do we strike a balance and how do we remedy this to make sure that attrition is as low as possible and retention is as high as possible? That was it. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any further questions, feel free to ask us.